Righty. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's topic. This time, I'm going to be looking at DNA and the flood. A strange combination, but hopefully by the end, you'll see how they fit together and are consistent with a biblical understanding of Genesis and the events thereof, but also how it connects with our knowledge today in terms of science and evidence that we've been able to determine. And so this kind of connects with my previous presentation, how I talked about the early world before the flood. So basically an alternative explanation of how things came together and time and events and how they coincidentally line up between a biblical narrative and what science suggests, although on probably a more compressed timescale. Today, I want to look at the flood itself. We kind of touched on some elements last time, but we'll focus on that, evidence for the flood and the narrative and how it happened as it did, and the changes that we've seen in the world since then, and the evidence that points to it having been an event in our past. But let's start with the obvious. It's a big boat. Would it float? This seems to be a sticking point for a lot of people. And strangely enough, when filming the movie Noah in 2014 with Russell Crowe, the Hollywood boffins employed a bunch of scientists to study the feasibility of the Ark's dimensions. And so they got a bunch of grad students onto it, and they discovered that the Ark and its dimensions could support the mass of over 50,000 tons of weight. And that could roughly support 70,000 animals, including its weight and its food for a year and all that sort of stuff. And so that's some cool evidence from the science folk about the mass and what it could physically hold in terms of weight. However, they were unsure from that particular study if the volume was large enough. So it could hold enough weight, but could you actually fit enough elephants in that thing? Given that there's an estimated 8.7 million species of animals in the world today. So 8.7 million species times a male and female, that is a lot of animals, even though it's a big boat. So tick, let's say, yes, it can support the mass, but what about the size? How does that work? But before we get to size, we need to think about, okay, it can support mass, but would it roll over? Would it break? Would it actually float and do its thing? And so obviously the Ark was constructed thousands and thousands of years ago, well before boats of any real significance that we're aware of were constructed. So they were quite limited, quite small. And yet, as our knowledge has kind of grown and developed, we've sailed around the world a zillion times now, come up with all sorts of big boats, and the Ark shape is still determined to be ideal. It's not the fastest, it's not the most comfortable, it's not the most stable, but it's in that sweet spot in the middle, as you can see on this graphic here. If it was too long, it'd be nice and comfortable. If it was nice and wide, it'd be nice and stable, wouldn't rock so much for seasickness. If it was nice and tall, it'd be strong. But being a balance of these in the middle, those ideal dimensions allowed it to move lots of cargo at a gentle pace and not die in the flood, because that would be bad. And so some studies have suggested it could handle waves 30 meters high. And so even in like a global raging torrent of all these flood waters, it would have had the strength and the capacity to survive. May not have been comfy, but it did the job, and it didn't have to go anywhere quick. It just had to float around. And so it's actually ideal proportions for these, despite ship makers at the time not having this sort of knowledge and probably expertise. So that can only have been given by God in the blueprints and the directions that he gave to Noah. And not only are these proportions still useful, they're actually adapted for the SS Great Britain, which was the world's largest passenger boat in the 1850s. I've got an image down here. I think that one's a replica, but it gives you the idea of the rough dimensions. It wasn't big and chunky like that, but it had those ideal proportions that allowed it to do its job, moving a lot of people relatively comfortably and safely. All right, so it's big, floats, it holds lots of mass, but just how big are we talking? And so this is the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, where Ken Ham and co. have built a replica of how they imagine it would have looked. And this is based on the dimensions given in the Bible. And so converted to metric, this is 145 meters long, so 1.5 football fields, 24 meters wide and 15 meters high. And so you can see the individual people there. We're talking a really big ship. That is a lot of space. And by doing a bit of maths, side times length times height, we get a volume of 52,200 cubic meters. And so that's a space. Could that space fit those animals? It's big, but is it big enough for 8.7 million species? The answer to that is no, but we'll talk about why that is now. And so would it fit that many species? No. But all the animals that we know today would not have necessarily been present on the ark. And so there's some conjecture as to whether all the animals did in fact go on the ark. So for example, I've got a link here where it discusses the meaning of the Hebrew word used for animals, and that is not inclusive of insects, for example. So maybe there weren't bugs on the ark. There probably would have had to be some to get some food chains going, but maybe some others would have been elsewhere. I don't know. But what I'm more interested in is, rather than the word species, which is what we as mankind and humans today call animals that can breed together, the Bible instead speaks of kinds. And this is not quite the definition of species. These kinds were most likely precursors to the current species. So there are a number of kinds on the ark, and they have diverged into species since that time. And so we're not talking 8.7 million species on the ark. We're talking estimates in the range of 1,500 to 50,000 species. So that's still a huge range. It's still a guessing game, but it is possible that that number of species could have diverged into what we see today. And suddenly these numbers, rather than 8.7 million, are looking a lot more likely to have been able to fit in a boat that can carry 50,000 tons. And so in the lower ranges, maybe 10, 20,000, easy fit. 50,000 might be a bit squishy, but hey, it could have been done. Not all the animals need a whole ton and a whole bunch of space for them. And obviously God probably would have sent young ones that were for both space reasons and viability. You want the young, fertile, small ones to fit on the boat so you can repopulate the earth. And so just for a size comparison at the top here, we can see that the Ark is the biggest of the wood ships. It's a lot bigger than the Santa Maria and the Wyoming, smaller than some of the steel Titanic and cruise liners that we see today, but we're still talking a big ship. And how did all those animals fit? Well, those number of species, there were probably less species previously, and they've since kind of diverged into more species since. So what does that look like? How do we know that there are more animal types today than what there were previously? We need to start talking about DNA and how evolution, for lack of a better word, happens over time, survival of the fittest and so on. And so this is an example of how kinds could have diverged to become different species here. And so this is a chart that shows from time. So at the top, we're talking further back in history. So it says 100,000 years ago. From a young Earth perspective, you'll compress these timelines, but it still holds true that there were older things and then newer things, regardless of what the numbers might be. And so this shows ancestral wolf populations coming from way back. So maybe a wolf may have been a kind that was present on the ark. And since that time, the wolves have since diverged into a number of species. And so we can measure using DNA sequencing evidence. We look at their entire DNA sequence of like a wolf and a dog and a dingo, that kind of stuff. We compare them and see all these similarities, but hey, there's these differences too. And we can kind of trace back how long ago they were closely related and how recently they've kind of come to diverge using DNA analysis and fossil history too. So there's mention of fossils here. And so from those ancestral wolf populations, obviously wolves still continue today. That's that big arrow here. But we can see here there were these little branching events. So over on the far left here, we have modern dogs. And so these these are your standard dog breeds, more than 350 now, apparently. I don't even know if that includes crosses, probably not. And then in the middle, we have dingoes, which are kind of in the middle. So these dingoes in New Guinea and Australia too, sometimes they're semi-domesticated or just like feral dogs. Dingoes on the mainland, that sort of stuff. But in terms of DNA, we can see how the poodle in the backyard and the dingo and the wolf, they all have that common lineage going back, which can be traced with DNA. And so this is a mechanism by which we can have 8.7 million species today, but still only have, thousands of kinds that we could fit on an ark of that size as described in the Bible. All right, so you might be thinking, can animals really become that different? Can we literally change species and have all this new stuff changing? I've got a link here that actually shows, just household pet dogs and how they've changed in the last 100 years. So I've got the link there for you guys to check out later. We'll look at some examples. And so this is the Basset hound. So that old photo 100 years ago. And then on the right, they're a bit more droopy. They look pretty similar, but you can see that there are some changes there. And some species look pretty similar, but others are quite dramatically different. So for example, the boxer, he looks fairly different. You can see his head's, almost a different shape. The body shape is different too. The bulldogs are more extreme examples. So they're really short and stumpy and just really skin and stuff happening everywhere. And then the bull terrier too, we've got this clearly different shaped head and all that sort of thing. And so this is only 100 years of humans saying, I like that trait. I'm gonna get that dog and that dog, which have that trait, breed them together, keep doing that. And eventually that trait will become really strong, really common, and almost exaggerated as the other traits are kind of bred out of what's going on. And so this can only happen in 100 years. And so if you think of the thousands of years since Noah's time, that is plenty of time for species to have adapted and become new species as a result. And so we as humans have done this, artificially by breeding dogs the way we want to. Selective breeding, that's the word I'm thinking of. But in the environment, this is forced by environmental factors. So as their environment changes or varies, they adapt because a certain trait allows them to be more successful. The others are less successful. They pass on less offspring. Maybe they die off. And over time, it creates this new emphasis on different traits, which over time causes them to diverge and look like entirely different species by the end. And so that's what we can see happening in 100 years in animals. There's also a really good example of this in plants. And so we as humans cultivate plants as well. We selectively breed plants. And then one well-known example is the species of Brassica oleracea. So this was the wild cabbage originally. This was cultivated back in Greek and Roman times, even since. So in the thousands of years that have followed, though, we have come up with modern cultivations. Well, the modern cultivations are more, they have diverged more. And so, for example, if you select for the terminal buds, you're going to get a cabbage. You continue to look, I want lots of buds, I want lots of buds. I got a big bud, it's a cabbage. And so this original wild cabbage plant becomes that. But if I like the lateral buds, which are a bit different, I get something similar but different, I get my Brussels sprouts. If I like the stem, I don't even know what that is. But if I want the leaves, I get kale, the stems and flowers, broccoli, flower clusters, cauliflower. And so by choosing the, not animals, but the organisms, the plants that have the feature you like, I really like the leafy stuff. I'm going to keep planting and breeding the ones that have the leaves. Over time, you're going to select and have that focus, that trait exaggerated, if you will. And we see what is still the same species, but what we would call different fruits and different vegetables. And so cabbage, red cabbage, kale, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, broccolini, all of these are the one plant, and they are still one single distinct species. But they have what's called cultivars or subspecies thereof. And so that is not an exhaustive list. There are actually others in there. It's a very versatile plant, and this has only happened through selective breeding of one species over the course of thousands of years. And so again, this is more evidence that those original kinds could have branched into all these different species for animals, but we see it in plants as well. And that's what allows them to have fitted on the ark as described in the Bible. All right, so let's talk about DNA in people now. So obviously change over time, kind of a big effect on animals. Humans are organisms also. We have DNA also. And so in the beginning, Adam and Eve were created with the genetic material for all humans because they were the originator of all humans. And God made things and it was very good. And so their DNA was very good. And they had all the traits for all the people. And so they would have probably looked pretty indeterminate in terms of their coloring, their features and that sort of thing. But what's happened since then is sin was introduced in the world. The curse is brought upon the world. And over time, our DNA has actually begun to mutate, as we've spoken about in previous sessions. And those mutations accumulate over time. They don't revert all the time. Our body does a bit of proofreading, but over time they will build up. And so in an individual, that's what causes cancer and those sorts of things over time. But through the generations, those mutations can accumulate. And basically we're devolving as a species. Our DNA is getting full of more mistakes and full of more mush. And so we'd expect to see more genetic diseases and that sort of thing. And so while they started off with that great perfect DNA of Adam and Eve, not many mutations. In the time since, we took all the humans in the world at that time, thousands or maybe even millions of people, and we reduced it down to 8. So that was Noah and his family, Noah and 3 sons and their wives. And so after the flood, the entire world was repopulated in terms of humans by only 8 people. And this is a huge bottleneck in terms of DNA and traits, okay? And so small populations, as a result of this, they face a huge range of issues. And so 8 humans, that's a small population. And so when this happens, we would expect increased likelihood of genes disappearing entirely. So maybe some of the early humans had purple hair and all those purple-haired humans were lost in the flood. I don't know. But maybe there are some other traits that were lost entirely. because out of all the people and all the things, we only selected those 8. Those 8 may not have had a big cross-section of the genes and the traits that were originally available. And so this can cause issues with things like inbreeding. So inbreeding rather causes issues because of damaged genes. So as those mutations accumulate, we have 2 copies of our genetic material in all of our body. And so if one is damaged, the other one covers for it. It's a bit of a redundancy thing. And so for someone to have a genetic disorder or a disease, that's what happens when both copies of that gene are stuffed and they have the issue that's caused by that gene not doing its job. So inbreeding is an issue because if the people are related, they're more likely to have the same copy of a damaged gene. And if they then come together and have children, both copies, one from the other, you have a higher risk of getting a damaged copy from this one and a damaged copy from this one because both of them are a much more similar source. And so that's the reason for inbreeding causing issues today. So early on, that wouldn't have been a big issue because they started with the perfect DNA. There weren't that many mutations that have accumulated, but as time goes on, that's when God introduced the idea of, hey, don't marry anyone that's closer than your cousin. That's going to cause issues with inbreeding. And so that's another issue of small populations. Not sure how damaged Noah and his family would have been by that time in terms of DNA and whether they had issues there. But again, small population problems because of DNA, and that likely would have infected some individuals. And small populations, as they spread and adapt, these issues can be magnified. If you have a small group and then they split, become an even smaller group, these issues can become magnified. And so it's only 4 generations later after the flood that mankind was spread all over the earth at the Tower of Babel. And so that could have magnified some of these issues, caused a lot of problems, DNA that wasn't great. And it's probably also the reason that we see, ethnicities and races of people that have very common features. So they've adapted to that area. Well, the people that moved to that area in the first place only had a certain type of genetics. And so all the people that have flourished in that area since have similar features for whatever reason. And so, so this would have caused some serious DNA issues, as humans certainly aren't as well off as what they were in the beginning. God's original perfect creation is not quite as nice as it could have been. Excuse me. So what does this mean? So this would have no doubt affected the lifespan of humans. And so there's an interesting verse in Genesis 6:3. And depending on your interpretation and translation of the Hebrew, there's some conjecture as to what this means. So NIV says, the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with humans forever. If they're mortal, for they are mortal, their days will be 120 years. So some people suggested this 120 years was a countdown to the flood. 100 years for Noah to build the boat, get ready, flood happens 120 years later. Whereas NLT says, the Lord says, my spirit will not put up for humans for a long time, for their mortal flesh. In the future, their lifespan will be no more than 120 years. So rather than a countdown to the flood, some people would suggest that this is a cap on the human lifespan, and we've since seen, much shorter lifespan. Adam lived to the age of 930. These days, you've had a good run if you make it to 90, 100. And so what's going on? I would suggest that the DNA is the mechanism of this. So not only those mutations that have accumulated over time, but just that bottlenecking of repopulating the earth from 8 people, that can't have been a good thing. And so for me, I'm not worried about the interpretation of the verse and what it might mean. Either way, we had long lifespans now, we have short ones now. DNA appears to be the mechanism for this, so directed by God through the flood or whatever it might have been. That's one possible explanation for what we see today. All right, so we've talked about DNA and how it's affected species, animals and humans and plants since the flood. What are some other, evidence of the flood that we've seen? One of the big ones is fossils. So I've touched on fossils previously. Fossils are where we have an imprint of an organism that was before. This happens when it's buried quickly under sedimentation, and over time, water leaches through it, and it allows the minerals carried by that water to deposit in that space and slowly to basically fill out with rock. And so the shape of that original living organism will be replaced by a rock that we call a fossil. That's one mechanism, but that's probably the common one that I like to think of. And so this is a really, really rare event because something has to die. It has to be buried quickly before scavengers can eat it, or even bacteria feeding on oxygen can break it down. So we're talking no oxygen, we're talking no scavengers. Being buried quickly is the way to go. That's the way to do it. So scientists say that, yeah, sediment just settles over time, and that's how the fossilization happens. It's really rare, but I'm like, I can't see it ever happening without an organism specifically being buried, because there's always going to be oxygen there. There's always going to be scavengers there. There's always decomposers in an environment. And so, so the idea of slow sediment settling and it being a rare event, that doesn't lend itself nicely to the idea of fast fossils. So I've got an example here of a fast fossil. This is a jellyfish that's been fossilized. And so jellyfishes waste away within 3 days once they're dead. And so that needs to be a fast fossil for you to see a jellyfish. And so this is from the Smithsonian. This is in one of their exhibits there. So that's one example of a fast fossil. I've got some other links here. They're actually embryos. Embryos break up in water in a few hours if they're no longer viable. So we're talking really quick. We're talking meals preserved in stomachs before it's even had a chance to be digested. We see plenty of examples of fast fossils where things would have had to be buried quickly before scavengers and get bacteria can get to it. And so if we think this in terms of a connection to a flood, what will we expect to see if the whole earth is covered in water, stirring up continents worth of sediment and killing all the living creatures? We're going to see a lot of fast fossilization. We'll see ideal conditions. And so consequently, fossils can be a great evidence for Noah's flood, as opposed to just a generic, oh, the inland seas over millions of years and that sort of thing. And so one example we see is Hell Creek in the US. And so this is a place with a high concentration of fossils, essentially. And so the scientists have studied the area extensively, as you might imagine. And the most current theory is that there's been 90 meters of sediment deposited, so 90 meters vertical, lots and lots of grains of sand and rock over time. Over 2 million years, this happened 66 million years ago, during a period when there was a shallow sea covering North America, and it split the east from the west. So this is inland sea, sediment settling over millions of years, 90 meters vertically worth of it. And in this, we see 180 dinosaur fossils from all sorts of species, including newly discovered ones we haven't found anywhere else. So they've catalogued 18,000 items so far. So lots and lots of fossils, lots and lots of interesting things to see. And their prevailing theory is that these deaths were caused by a meteorite off the coast of Mexico, came along, caused a tsunami, boom, drowning things, burying things. That's why we see all this fossilization. And so I find that a bit strange because it's a one single impact event. And yet the theory is that 90 meters of sediment happened over 2 million years. I don't know how they connect together, but I guess it's a best of both worlds approach. But what's interesting about this, though, is while they have all these models about sedimentation, how it can cause fossils, what we see in practice does not always align with these models. And so I've linked to a paper here that shows some issues with the different types of sands and sedimentation and how they occur in different conditions. I don't understand a whole lot of it, but apparently there's some evidence that sedimentation does not always happen as planned, and it can make fossils a little bit quicker than what we expect. And so here I've got an image, an example of what it was theorized to be, so 65 million years ago. We've got that inland sea through the middle, splitting the land on either sides. And that big red dot at the bottom is that meteorite strike causing a tsunami, pushing through that inland sea, causing lots of fossils. Yes, that makes sense, but even bigger and even better, it's a global flood. You're dumping all of it, continents worth of stuff, lots of things. That makes more sense to me. And so here's some examples of the dinosaurs of Hell Creek. It's 22 species. I can't say any of them except for Triceratops. Apparently there's lots of Triceratopses there, and all sorts of weird and wonderful varieties as well. All right, so I've put together a little table of some comparisons of the things we see and a comparison between the scientific explanation and a biblical explanation for these. And so the first one is obviously lots of fossils, despite fossils being a rare thing. And so the scientists, as I mentioned before, they've explained 90 meters of sediment deposited over 2 million years, whereas a biblical explanation from the flood might be lots of sediment deposited in, the 40 days or the coming months after a worldwide flood. And so that is much more likely to provide those ideal conditions, because even 2 million years of dust settling, you're still not going to have those hypoxic conditions. You're still not going to have scavengers, an absence of scavengers that would ruin your day. So secondly, not only is there lots of fossils despite the rarity, they're highly concentrated. And so the scientists' explanation is there's this junction of the eastern and western shallows and the inland sea coming together. Whereas a worldwide flood example might be lots of large currents. You imagine as they swirl and whirl around, they're eventually going to settle into patterns, and there's going to be these huge currents just pushing a lot of stuff in the same direction. Eventually it's going to hit a snag or a place where it's going to collect, and hence we see this high concentration of fossils over a small area. And so next is land and sea animals buried together. And so the scientists have no established theory for this, but obviously a worldwide event covering land and sea, that is going to be a clear explanation of why we see land and sea things buried together in the same place. And then next is not only are there land and sea things together, there's freshwater and saltwater things together. And so the scientists say that a variety of species may have had a different tolerance for saltwater over time. But again, I think just sticking everything in a giant soup, mashing it together is a good explanation for that. And lastly, there's a monkey puzzle tree has been found in this area, and this is native only to the southern hemisphere. And so a tree that's come from the other side of the earth, essentially. So scientists explain that the change in climate was different. So maybe during that time period, that tree had the ideal conditions to thrive and grow there, or perhaps with the global flood, it may literally have been carried there from the southern hemisphere. All right, so that's it for today. Just to recap, we've talked about evidence for the flood as per the biblical text. We've talked about how the boat can support the mass, how it is big enough to support a number of species, knowing that those species were actually what the Bible called kinds, and they've since diverged into more variety at that time, and therefore require more space initially on the ark. And so we saw that it could be sufficient, it could be strong enough there. We've talked about how DNA has changed for animals and humans, how that happens over time, and how we see the effects of the change from the early Earth to Noah's flood to what we see today, as DNA has mutated and we've seen bottlenecks in human population. And lastly, we saw that Noah's flood was an ideal example, ideal conditions of how many fossils could accumulate, and Hell's Creek is a great example of all these fossils coming together as a result of a large event like the flood. Finish with a verse from Genesis. So God said, "This is the sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature, covenant for generations to come." What is that sign? It's the rainbow set in the clouds, be a sign for the covenant for us. And when I bring my clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I'll remember my covenant between you and all living creatures of every kind, and never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life. And so while the rainbow has become a symbol for many things, originally God intended as a symbol, as a promise that he's never going to flood the earth and destroy things like he has before. What he said is he's going to come back one day and separate the sheep from the goats and bring in a new age for his people. And so here are the references if you're interested in any of those things. So feel free to click on those and dig a bit more into that information. But otherwise, thanks again for listening in, and I'll see you all next time.